This happened when I was in my early 20s in the year 2003. At that time, I was a taxi driver, a job I did during my college years. I mainly worked the night shift because it was the only way to coordinate my schedule. After dropping off my last passenger, I headed home. On my route, there was a new housing project that I had passed several times. Based on the size of the unfinished houses, I could see that a lot of money had been invested there. During the day, the place was full of construction workers and landscapers, but it was almost 2 a.m., and all that was left were piles of wood and idle machines like excavators and bulldozers. The neighborhood bordered a forest, another sign that it was an upscale development. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly drove through the construction site. There was a sign that said, "Drive slowly due to workers." I didn't know if that applied in the middle of the night, but I couldn't afford to risk a fine, so I adhered to it anyway. As I drove past a large dump truck, my headlights illuminated the figure of a man. I didn't have time to react before he ran up to my window. Completely frightened, I quickly locked the doors and made sure all my windows were closed as he approached the driver's side window. I could see that he was a clean-looking guy, probably in his 40s. He wore a flannel shirt with blue jeans and sneakers. He seemed like just a normal guy. Normal except for the fact that he was absolutely terrified, with tears streaming down his face and his whole body trembling. He stood beside my car. His muffled words were unintelligible through my closed windows. Maybe I should have driven away, but for some reason, I decided to listen to him. I opened my window just enough to hear him. "Please, sir, please let me in. I have money," he pleaded. "Is there someone I can call for you?" I offered. "There's no time. He's coming." The man begged. "Who is coming?" I asked, confused. "Please, sir, there's no time to explain," he cried. At this point, I was more than a little unsettled. Part of me wanted to help him, but we were so alone out there, and his urgency to get into the car worried me. Most taxi drivers have a story about a passenger they shouldn't have picked up. It's an unfortunate part of the job, but robberies do happen. I decided not to let him in. "Wait, I'll call the police for you," I said. "No, there's no time. Please," he pleaded. As I pulled away, I could hear him running behind my car, screaming for help. My heart was torn as I heard him cry. I drove straight to the police station and told them what had happened. They told me to go home and that they would send someone to look for him. I did as they said. After a sleepless night, I called the police station to check if they had found him. They told me they had sent 2 patrol cars to the place where I had seen him, but they hadn't found anything. I was somewhat relieved, hoping he had found another ride or that my fears were justified and he had bad intentions. A few days later, I saw the news. There was a report about a body found in the woods near the place where I had met the man. They showed a photo of the victim, and it was him, the man who had asked me for help that night. The reporter said the cause of death was an animal attack, but I don't believe that. There were no animals in that forest larger than a raccoon. Moreover, I clearly remember the man saying, "He's after me." If it had been an animal, he would have said so. It was hard to deal with the guilt I felt for turning my back on a person in need. I think many people would understand that, but it's still difficult. However, many questions remain unanswered. What was he running from? Why was he being chased? And most frightening of all, whatever it was, is it still out there? This is a true story that happened in September 2020. I was on a trip to Germany, where most of my family and friends live, apart from those in the state of Hidalgo. Not to brag, but my family is extremely wealthy, much more than I can convey. In fact, my uncle is still a billionaire to this day. Therefore, I had my own supercar, a 2020 Lamborghini Aventador SV, in Germany. I also have my own car in Mexico. My cousins, who also had a lot of money, were in Germany at that time. We decided to take a drive on the German Autobahn with our supercars. For those who don't know, the Autobahn is a highway in Germany without speed limits. The group consisted of me and my cousins David, Lucas, and Santiago. David had a Ferrari SF90, Lucas was driving his Porsche, and Santiago was in his McLaren 720S. We began our tour at 8 p.m., and before we knew it, we were driving just over 260 kilometers per hour. I was having fun when I noticed that something was wrong with David and that he had disappeared from the group. I looked around to make sure I wasn't mistaken, but to my dismay, I wasn't. David had indeed vanished. I called my other cousins and told them to stop. When I told them what had happened, they were as confused and horrified as I was, because there was no way that David could have suddenly disappeared at 250 kilometers per hour. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. We did something that would probably have earned us a fine. We turned around and drove on the Autobahn in the opposite direction to look for David. When we reached the spot on the Autobahn where David was last seen, we decided to park our cars and search for him in the forest next to the long Autobahn. Not even 3 minutes passed when I could hear cries for help. It was David's voice. We ran in the direction from which the voice came, only to realize something that still makes me shudder every time I think about it. While we were running, the cries for help remained at the same distance, as if David, or whatever was pretending to be David, was moving away from us while crying for help. We began to panic and started crying out of frustration. We searched and searched but couldn't find him. With tears in our eyes, we called Lucas's parents, who were just as anxious as we were. They called the police and we waited until they arrived. A large search team was organized, which took 3 days to find David's Ferrari. The peculiar thing was that the car showed no signs of an accident. It was completely intact. There wasn't a scratch and nothing was missing inside, except for David. The search continued but without success. After a year, the case was closed because no one could understand how such a thing could happen unless it was a glitch in the Matrix or something. It's 2022, and I still miss my dear cousin and cry for him. His car was returned to us and sometimes I drive it. I still hope that, for some reason, he is okay or at least alive and can be found. This event has shaken me to the core. This is a disturbing story that happened a few years ago. I was on my way home from a friend's house. I lived in the countryside, so I often drove into town to spend time with friends. I don't exactly remember what we did that night, but often we went bowling, to the movies, or just got some ice cream and spent time in the park. What I know is that we lost track of time, and it was already past midnight when I drove home. My home was about 5 kilometers from the main road. That means 5 kilometers of unpaved roads with no lighting. So it can be a bit creepy at night. It's amazing how dark it really gets. So dark that you can't see your hand in front of your face when the lights go out. Therefore, I always drive slowly in the dark, as you can only see about 5 or 6 meters ahead. So if you need to stop to avoid a deer or a pothole, it helps to have that extra time. Not many people live there, so I was surprised to see a man standing by the side of the road. He was at that point about 800 meters from the main road. My headlights illuminated his body as he stood there and greeted me with a friendly smile. He was a tall, large, and stocky man with a mustache and an old baseball cap. If I had to guess, I would say he was in his 30s. I know that in my head, alarm bells should have been ringing, but he really didn't seem threatening. Also, people in the countryside tend to help each other, so perhaps that's why I trusted him. I slowed down and he approached the driver's window. As I stopped, he said, "How are you, ma'am? I'm sorry to bother you, but could you give me a ride into town?" he said. I didn't hesitate and agreed. "Of course, get in," I said. "Thank you very much. I really appreciate it." "I'm Marcus," he said gratefully. "Well, you're welcome, Marcus. I'm Lisa," I replied. As naive as it sounds, he was so polite that I just had to trust him. I turned the car around and headed back to the main road. As I said, we were only about half a kilometer away at that point, so it wasn't a big deal to give him a ride. We chatted for a few minutes. His calm demeanor made me feel at ease, even though I was alone in a car with a stranger. But after no more than 10 minutes, he said, "I'm very sorry to have to do this, ma'am, "But I need to take your car." I had to pause to process what I was hearing. "What are you talking about?" pleaded. As I said, "I need to take the car." "Let's not make this difficult," he said. I stood there, speechless, in disbelief. I was about to say a few things when he suddenly pulled out a pistol and pointed it directly at me. My heart almost stopped as I looked at him. He had an expression of regret on his face, as if he really felt bad for what he was doing. I brought the car to a stop and got out. Marcus got into the driver's seat and looked at me. "One last thing, ma'am. I need your phone. I can't afford for you to call the police," he explained. I said nothing. I just gave him my phone. My whole body was shaking. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," he said before driving off into the night. I walked for about 30 minutes before I was finally able to flag down a police car. I told them what had happened. While we drove to the station to file a report, the officer told me that my description matched that of a man wanted for several armed robberies in this and other nearby towns. It was incredible. He was waiting for someone to pass by on the road to take advantage of their kindness. I was that unfortunate person. It really messed with my mind that such a polite and friendly person could turn on me in an instant. I have always been someone who tries to help others, but this made me question my entire worldview. Why should I put myself in danger for someone who could harm me? That's a decision we all have to make for ourselves. I don't want to give up on what the world has to offer or anything. It's just something to think about. Take care out there, and look after your loved ones. On another day, I left work around 11 p.m. I worked at a fast food restaurant on the other side of the city where I lived. The drive took about 45 minutes, which was quite long to earn minimum wage, but I couldn't find anything better, so I did it. Around 10 p.m., it started to rain, so when I finished at 11 p.m., the streets were very wet and slippery. I drove slowly during the first half of my journey. Visibility was poor due to the rain, and I was driving through a somewhat rural part of the city. I was on a paved road, but most of the side roads led into the countryside, where the roads were not paved. After a while, I noticed that not many cars were on the road, so I began to drive a bit faster. I know that wasn't smart, but I was tired and just wanted to go home and sleep. Suddenly, I noticed some red brake lights in front of me. I approached quickly and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I collided with a car, hitting the rear fender as it was trying to turn onto one of the rural roads. I knew immediately that I had messed up. The car had stopped abruptly, but it's common knowledge that in a rear-end collision, there's no doubt about who is at fault. Fortunately, I wasn't injured or anything because I managed to brake in time. What really went through my mind was how much money this would cost me, as I didn't earn much at that time. I parked my car on the side of the road and turned off the engine. Then I wiped a tear from my cheek before getting out of my car. First, I checked the damage to my car. One headlight was broken, and there was a big dent. I was sure it would cost a few €100 to repair at least, but it could have been worse. Then I turned my attention to the other car that had stopped in front of me. The other driver hadn't gotten out yet, so I waited between the two cars. The rain continued to fall. I expected to be yelled at and felt that I deserved it. After another 30 seconds, the front door of the other car opened, and a man got out. He was an average-looking guy, probably in his 40s, with a gray hoodie and blue jeans. I also noticed a pistol at his waist as he leaned over. That wasn't unusual where I live because many people carry firearms, but that added tension to the situation. I had no idea how he would react. He went back to his car to assess the damage. It was about the same damage as on my car. A broken taillight and a big dent. Then he looked up and came toward me. I could see a small drop of blood on his face, definitely caused by the accident. That was the moment when I knew I had really messed up. "It just looks like a scratch. Don't worry about it, friend," he said to me. "Are you sure? Did you notice that you're bleeding?" I replied, "Yeah, that's from something else. Just go," he said. He was young, but I knew that if someone was injured in an accident, you have to report it to the police. Any problem where I was would be much worse if I didn't report it. So I said to the guy, "I'm going to call the police." I don't remember exactly what he said after that, but he tried to persuade me not to report the accident. Still, I was persistent and pulled out my phone to dial the emergency number. Then his mood changed. He became angry and started approaching me. He didn't do anything obviously threatening, but he really invaded my personal space. It was like a show of power, combined with the fact that he was armed, and it seriously intimidated me. Quickly, I agreed not to call. Then I put my phone back in my pocket. The guy immediately stepped back, then turned around and went back to his car. I stood there for a minute, still shaken by what had happened. But just at the moment when the man drove off in his car, I had enough common sense to memorize his license plate. I won't say what it was, but I repeated it several times in my head before it disappeared into the distance. Then I went back to my car and called the police. I told them what had happened, that I was involved in a car accident where the other driver was injured but refused to involve the police. They seemed to take the situation very seriously, and when I gave them the license plate number, they checked it in their system. It turned out that the car had been stolen several days earlier. Not only that, but it had also been used in an armed robbery since then. Finally, I understood why the man didn't want me to call the police. They asked me to come to the police station and give a description of the man. It was after midnight when I arrived there, and I was dead tired, but I knew how important it was to get this guy off the streets. So I went. I did my best to help with the investigation in every way I could. I heard that they eventually caught him and charged him with several crimes. The damage to my car was about 2,000 euros, which I paid out of my own pocket, and I was never charged for the damage to the other car, although I suspect that the rightful owner could pursue me for that. In any case, the money isn't important. This guy was really dangerous, and if I had been more insistent about calling the police while he was there, I have no doubt that he would have done something. Something really terrifying happened to me when I was about 18 years old in the early 90s. At that time, I loved cars and enjoyed working on my own, even though I was a girl. I had a 1979 Camaro Z28 with T-tops, and in the summer, I loved driving around with my friends looking for something to do. One night, as I was cruising up and down the main street in a neighboring town, I noticed a small red van following us from a distance. I was with my friend Julia and mentioned to her that I thought the van was following us. I turned into the parking lot of a fast food restaurant and noticed that the van also pulled in 3 cars behind us. I turned in the other direction, and he did the same again. I did this several times, and the van still followed us, always keeping a distance of 3 cars. Julia and I decided that we should drive home, which was about 30 minutes away. We thought the driver of the van would simply give up and let us go. But he didn't. He continued to follow us. It was getting really late, and we started to worry because the van had been following us for almost an hour. We didn't want to go home and have him know where we lived. I decided it would be best to drive to the nearest police station. I told Julia what I planned to do, and to my horror, she grabbed the steering wheel and jerked it so that the car suddenly swerved to the right. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "You're going to make us crash." It was bad enough worrying about this van following us, but now I also had to deal with my passenger panicking and causing an accident. "We can't go to the police," she insisted. Then it suddenly dawned on me that she somehow thought we were guilty, that somehow, just because we were driving around, she thought we had done something to provoke this. Reluctantly, I steered away from the police station. We approached a bridge and stopped at a red light on the one-way street. The van was right behind the car next to us. That car turned right, letting the van pass. I looked over and was shocked to see that the guy had gotten out of his van and was standing next to my car's passenger door, without pants. This guy hadn't just pulled his pants down to his ankles. In fact, he wasn't wearing any at all. I hit the gas and drove through the red light over the bridge. For some reason, my friend didn't see him through her window. When I told her, she kept saying, "That can't be. I drove up and down a few more streets and then over the bridge and out into the countryside. He followed us for what felt like an eternity until we finally managed to lose him by driving very fast into the middle of nowhere. We returned home and tried to forget about it. For some reason, I never told my parents, and I'm not sure why. A few weeks later, I saw on the news that the police were looking for a man in a small red van. They showed his photo, and he looked like the guy I had seen who had followed us. I thought the description of the van was slightly different from the one we had seen, but maybe not. I've always wondered if it was him, and I believe it was. I was 16 years old when this event happened. My close friend Sabine and I were on our way back from visiting my distant family in the state of Thuringia, Germany. At that time, I lived in Freiburg. It was 11 p.m., and we were the only ones on the road. I had never taken this route before but wanted to avoid the highways this time, so we decided to try it. Sabine and I were so engrossed in our conversation that we didn't notice we were approaching an abandoned village. When I finally noticed our surroundings, I had a terrible feeling in my stomach. My friend noticed it and asked if everything was okay. "Yes, I'm fine, although this village is quite creepy," I responded. I wasn't lying. There were old houses with boarded-up windows, closed shops, and even abandoned cars and trucks. Honestly, it looked like a scene from a horror movie. My friend and I stayed silent. You could feel the drastic change in the air. Felt eerie. A few minutes passed in silence, and my car began to shudder. I realized we were running out of fuel. I had forgotten to stop in a town a few kilometers back. I stopped in front of an abandoned house. "A great place to break down," Sabine joked nervously. I agreed with her sarcastic comment. I took out my phone to call the breakdown service my parents had saved in it, only to notice we had no reception. Sabine and I got out of the car, and that's when things started to get really strange and frightening. I was completely focused on getting a signal when I suddenly noticed Sabine staring ahead, looking frightened. She whispered my name and grabbed my shirt, then pointed forward. "There's a man about 3 meters from us," she whispered. I followed her gaze, and she was right. A man, almost 2 meters tall, stood in front of my car's headlights. How can someone be here? This place is an abandoned village, I thought. He didn't breathe or speak. My heart sank. Finally, Sabine spoke. "Do you need something?" she called out to him. At that moment, he tilted his head and smiled broadly, which frightened us even more. At that moment, I was so scared I couldn't even move. He just looked at us and smiled. "My father is a police officer, idiot," Sabine yelled. That was a big mistake on her part because his expression turned to anger, and he moved very quickly towards us. Our adrenaline levels spiked, and we ran to the car and locked the doors. We looked up, but he was gone. We stood confused until we heard a noise under the car. I was breathing so loudly that I was distracted by the noise. He was under my car. Sabine screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks, and I tried to stay calm, just praying that my phone had reception. Finally, I got 2 bars. I called the police and told them what had happened. They said they would be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes seemed like an eternity under these circumstances, but we were in the middle of nowhere, so that was what we had. When the call ended, the noise stopped. I was still on high alert, utterly frightened. I hugged Sabine, and we both cried. Her face went expressionless as she looked behind me to the rear window. My heart told me not to look, but I couldn't resist. This man, and for other people, 2 more men and 2 women, were standing behind our car. My heart sank again. They smiled at us in a very creepy way. At that moment, I heard the sirens of the police and sighed with relief. Sabine and I looked forward and saw a police car approaching. I had never been so relieved to see a police officer. As he approached our car, the people disappeared. I was so upset that I couldn't even explain to the officer what had happened. Sabine did it for me. They offered to bring us gasoline, but I begged them instead to take us to a hotel in a densely populated area and call my parents to pick us up. To this day, the police have never found these people, and we have never found out where they might have come from. I suspect they lived in one of the abandoned buildings. I hope that one day they seal off this village, and I never take that road again. This happened just a few days ago when I was on a road trip with my cousin Lucas. I was 13 years old, and Lucas was 21. I have a good relationship with my cousin, so my parents allowed me to travel with him from time to time. It was a 10-hour drive, and we had been on the road for hours. It was 9 p.m. and I was quite tired. Everything seemed funny to me, so I just started laughing when I saw a red truck outside my window. The man in the truck was quite burly, to put it mildly, and had a long, wild beard. He radiated a creepy aura, but I waved at him anyway. He made some kind of lewd gesture in my direction. I found it more funny than scary, so I started laughing even louder and told Lucas the story while imitating the gesture. He looked disgusted and repulsed, but there was nothing we could do about it. Several hours later, about an hour and a half into the journey, Lucas stopped at a rest stop. I went to the toilet, and when I came out, the man was there. He seemed to be at least 1.80 meters tall. I saw through the glass door to the building and saw Lucas angrily looking through the door. I was confused and went back to the car. What he told me really scared me so much that I started to cry, although I had been awake for 20 hours. The man was watching me and then followed me to the building. According to Lucas, he spoke basically normally. He tried to calm me down but quickly said that he needed to go to the toilet and went inside. A few seconds later, when I was in the car, the guy was at my window. He looked at me again with a wide, creepy smile. He started saying that I should come with him and that he would treat me well. He offered me candy and tried to persuade me to get into his truck. I was busy crying, so just at that moment, Lucas came out and yelled at the guy and threatened him. The man stepped back and returned to his truck, smiling at me. We drove away from there. We wanted nothing to do with this guy. It was about midnight when we arrived at the motel to sleep the rest of the night. Everything was fine until 8 a.m. the next morning. We were having breakfast in a restaurant, and this exact guy sat opposite us. He smiled at me, and I looked to Lucas, who was about to burst with anger. The guy walked past our table on the way to the toilet and brushed my shoulder. Then he did the same on the way back. It was definitely no accident. Both Lucas and I knew that. Lucas is a relaxed guy and lets almost everything slide. But since he's known me since I was born, he is very protective of me. This does not apply to my other siblings. He and I are close. He was already angry, but at this point he stood up and went to the guy's table. He began yelling at him to stop following us and to behave. He made no threats, but he cursed a lot. I felt pretty nervous and just wanted to leave. The guy got up and hit Lucas, then screamed that I had seduced him. Remember, I was 13 years old at this time. Their fight continued, and the police came and separated them. They listened to the story and concluded that since he had been attacked, we could press charges. Lucas decided not to do so, and we continued with the day. The rest of the trip was quite uneventful. The guy was not seen for the rest of the trip, but Lucas followed me like a bodyguard wherever we went. Although he protected me, I was still scared. I am 14 years old and quite small. I am only 1.60 meters tall and weigh 55 kilograms. I look younger than I really am. This happened a month ago when we moved. After we had loaded the moving truck, I fell asleep in it. 1 or 2 hours later, we were in a village near my new home. My grandma parked in the Burger King parking lot, and I was still asleep. So, my 19-year-old cousin, let's call him Maximilian, came to the passenger door and woke me up to help carry the food. I agreed, and we went to Burger King. She made her order, and then I touched his arm and told him I was going to the toilet. When I was done, I came out of the bathroom and noticed an older man, about 50 or 60 years old, looking at Maximilian and then at me. I didn't pay attention to him because I was still very sleepy. I went to Maximilian while he was trying to get a soda from one of the machines. Finally, after a while, he managed to get the soda, and we left Burger King. As I sat in the moving truck drinking my chocolate milkshake, I saw the man approaching the truck and said, "I know who you are," and stopped on the driver's side where my grandma was. She seemed quite confused and replied, "Who am I?" He said in the same voice, "The woman of God," and then started rambling about taking care of us girls. In the meantime, I was scared. Ideas of creepy things I had read on Reddit went through my mind. Suddenly, he pointed at me with a completely serious expression and said, "You are a plague." At this point, I was really confused and scared, so I began to laugh uncomfortably and muttered something. He continued to ramble until I heard Maximilian calling my name, saying I had left my fries in the bag, but I already had my fries. I went to him to ask what he meant, but he changed the subject to the man. About 5 minutes later, we agreed that he radiated creepy vibes. However, my grandma called my name to say that we would be leaving. The old man's car was blocking our way, so he got in and moved to let us through. He made the "I'm watching you" gesture with his fingers and moved his lips to say, "I'm watching you." That was the moment I grabbed my phone and called Maximilian. I told him to make sure he wasn't following us. Luckily, he didn't. It gives me chills to think that he was watching us the whole time while we were ordering our food and drinks. To understand the extent of this story, you first need to know who I am. So here's some context. I was born in 1954, so I spent my formative years under the influence of the 60s and early 70s in a very small village in northern Germany. When I was young, there was only one traffic light at the intersection of the main street. There were about 40 shops in the center of the village: a pharmacy, a grocery store, a hardware store, a stationery store, a general store, a gas station, and a barber shop. We had churches of various denominations, and most people regularly attended one of them. There was also a library, a post office, and a police station. The station was organized in such a way that one could easily walk past the desk officer. 9 out of 10 times you could go in and see if someone was in the cell, and if someone was there, we brought them news, fetched cigarettes, or whatever. We never bothered to ask why they were there. I was a curious child, a free spirit, and completely innocent. A little later came the Kennedy assassination, the civil rights movement, the protests against the Vietnam War, and the hippie revolution, which I joined, becoming one of the first hippies. In those years, it was common to hitchhike, so I did that often. Over a little more than 3 years, I made many trips across Germany, to my mother's horror. Sometimes I went with a friend, sometimes alone, always without money, without clothes, and without worries. Many people tried to warn me about the dangers, but as a very young and naive girl, I felt invincible and ignored all their well-meaning advice. This was not my first trip, nor was it the last, but it was the most memorable, and you will understand how narrowly I escaped a great danger. It was June 1969. I was 14 years old and spent the night at my friend Dina's house, who lived in a neighboring village. I persuaded her to come with me to Berlin. It turned out that she had a brother there, whom she had not seen for a while. So we made our way through the countryside to the highway and stuck our thumbs out. It never took long for us to get a ride. As you can imagine, we got many rides. A bus took us on the way to a concert in Hamburg. We didn't want to make this big detour, so we let it be. I don't remember which band it was anymore. I remember another ride where we got into a car with 4 people and went to a party in a residential area of Berlin. We were the only people from our village at that party, and let me tell you, we had a lot of fun. I never felt unwelcome or in danger. In fact, the kind lady who lived in that apartment gave me a shirt, which I thought was very nice. Now, as an adult, I realized that she was trying to cover me up. May God bless her. The next ride went quite well until we picked up another hitchhiker. It was a lonely boy who wouldn't stop annoying the driver about how much trouble he would get into if he was caught transporting these 2 underage girls across state borders. I got very excited and told him to shut up. We should have gotten off there, but we stayed. He wasn't dangerous, just annoying. The driver stopped to refuel at a gas station in Bavaria, and Dina and I went to the toilet to freshen up. When we came back, the police were waiting for us outside, and then we ended up at the station. I'm sure our parents were contacted immediately, although I don't remember. We were an attraction at the small station. The policemen came to talk to us and play cards. They brought us cigarettes, candies, and donuts. I don't think we were there long before Dina's mother came to pick us up, and after she had spoken to her daughter, she decided to bring us the rest of the way to Berlin, which was a little more than 1,900 kilometers away. Unbelievable. I remember that we sang the whole way to Hamburg on the radio. I particularly remember the song San Francisco by Mama and Papa. Later, we checked into a hotel in Hamburg. It was very boring there. Not what I had imagined. I tried to persuade Dina that we should leave, but now as an adult, I see how terrible and selfish that would have been and how disastrous it would have been for her mother. Luckily, she refused to do so, so I stayed. Eventually, we arrived in Berlin, right in the historical center near the university where all the hippie action took place. But we had Mama following us. It was overwhelming for me. I was pretty cool for our little village, but this was out of my reach. As I said, I was very naive and not fully aware of things like drug addiction, but I saw it firsthand in a nearby park. All the people who were drugged scared me a lot. I also saw other things that I cannot talk about, which shocked me. I wanted to go home, and I never wanted to go back to Berlin again. To this day, I don't remember how many weeks I was away on that particular adventure, but shortly afterward, I was back home watching TV with my mother. It was July, and in the news, they were talking about the Manson family and the notorious murders. That's when I realized how close I had been to being picked up by them and maybe becoming part of the family. What would have happened if I had gone out alone that evening and not stayed with Dina and her mother? Alone hitchhiking through the desert, 9 hours from a remote farm. What if that guy hadn't reported us to the police? Then we both would have been there, and most likely one or both of us would have been picked up by one of them. Later, I learned that the Manson family was actually recruiting people in Berlin where we were. I thank God every day that I was not involved. I was very ready to be chosen at that time, especially if they had caught me before we arrived. I remember the nights so vividly, although more than 12 years have passed. I was a teenager and spent time with some friends at my friend's house. We were just playing video games and joking around like teenagers do, but as the night progressed, it was time for everyone to go home. It was my turn to drive. I had taken my mother's nice minibus for the occasion, and my favorite part was that I could look pretty cool while driving. I wore cool sunglasses even though it was dark. I was glad to help, and it gave me the opportunity to spend a bit more time with my friends. The first 3 were dropped off without incident, but then it was time to visit Elton's house. I knew that Elton lived in a remote area, but I had no idea how far it was because I had never been there before. We drove along a long, winding gravel road surrounded by forest on both sides. It was so dark that I could barely see the road ahead. I drove slowly because I could only see as far as my headlights reached, even with high beams. After a long time, we arrived at Elton's house. It was a small, simple house hidden in the woods. He thanked me and jumped out of the minibus. Then I turned around and began the long journey back. I was nervous about the return trip, mainly because it was so dark and remote. I made sure not to miss any turns on the way there. I repeated the turns in my head several times and was pretty sure I would remember. I was about halfway back to the main road when something caught my attention. There was a man on the road just standing there. At first, I thought he was a hitchhiker, which was already strange because there was little traffic at that late hour. But as I got closer, he disappeared into the woods. I remember feeling really scared and confused. I was not sure what to think, but I knew it was not normal. I knew there were other houses in the area, but they were few and far between, so it made no sense to see someone walking, especially not at night. Finally, I got home and tried to forget the strange man in the woods. I told myself it must have just been someone from the area taking a nighttime walk, as unlikely as that sounded. However, it was only the next day that I learned of something terrible that had happened. I spent time again with my friends and told them what I had seen in the woods that night. But then someone mentioned that one of Elton's neighbors had disappeared that night. I listened in fear as they continued talking. I was sure it had to do with what I had seen. I could not believe what I was hearing. Was it possible that the strange man I had seen on the road was actually involved in the disappearance? The thought made me shudder. We called the police immediately. I told them I had been in the area and seen a strange man on the road in the middle of the night. The officers asked me to come to the station. I went and gave them a more detailed description of what I had seen that night and what had happened before. I tried to get more information about the case because I was curious, but I was told it was confidential. Well, that's probably fair. In the following days, I could not stop thinking about what had happened. I replayed the events in my head and wondered if there was anything I could have done differently. But in the end, there was really nothing I could have done. What should I have done? Stop and chase the man through the woods in the dark. The police searched the woods for days, especially the place where I had seen the man, but nothing was found, and Elton's neighbor never returned. After a few years, I had almost forgotten the whole situation. The case must have cooled down because I had not heard anything about it for a long time. That changed one day when I saw the news. The body of Elton's neighbor was finally found, but not at the place where I had seen the man. He was in a different part of the woods, more than 50 meters away. I still cannot stop thinking about that night and wondering if it was really him I saw on the road. I wonder if he moved the body to another location because he knew I had seen him. There is no way to be sure, but I believe that something terrible happened on those roads that night, something very bad. It happened on a warm September evening in Hesse in 2013, while I was driving on a deserted road. I noticed the full moon shining through the dense fog over the city. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, but fate had other plans for me. As I rounded the curve, I saw two cars parked on the side of the road, illuminated by the glow of a street lamp. As I got closer, I saw a man being threatened by another man with a gun. I slowed down as I drove by. The victim was trembling and pleading with the assailant, but he was unyielding in his demand for money and valuables. They didn't seem to notice me. Perhaps all the commotion was enough distraction to remain unnoticed. My hands began to tremble on the steering wheel as I realized I was witnessing a robbery in progress. I knew I had to act quickly, so I drove my car back to a dark section of the road and searched my bag for my phone. I dropped it on the floor of my car while still staring at the robbery. I bent down to pick up my phone without taking my eyes off the scene. Finally, I found it and dialed the emergency number. Then, I watched in horror as the assailant turned towards me. Until now, I thought I had been well hidden in the dark. But I was wrong. I quickly pressed the gas and drove away, praying he wouldn't follow me. I drove for several minutes with trembling hands on the steering wheel, remembering what I had just witnessed. Eventually, I stopped on the roadside, and my phone rang. It was the police. I wasn't sure how long I had been on the phone, but I imagined all they had heard from me was heavy breathing and perhaps some swearing. When I picked up the receiver, the officer told me someone was on their way and would arrive soon. Relieved, I hung up, knowing I had done the right thing by asking for help. But as I sat in the car waiting for the police, I noticed a car stopping behind me. At first, I thought it was the assailant because the car resembled one of those involved. Then I realized it was just another driver, probably curious about what was going on. With each passing minute, I began to feel more uneasy. The driver of the other car got out and paced behind his vehicle as if waiting for something. I started to think I was wrong and that it might actually be the assailant. My instincts told me something was not right, so I locked the doors and watched him carefully. Just as I was about to call the police again, I saw lights flashing in the distance. Finally, the police arrived, and I felt relief as I saw two police cars stop behind me. The other guy was still there. I thought if he were the assailant, he would probably have left by now, so I felt a bit more relaxed. But if he wasn't the assailant, who was he then? One of the officers came to my car, and we talked for a few minutes about what was going on. He told me to stay in my car and walked away. Both officers approached the other driver, who had stopped pacing and now stood still next to his car. I watched through the rearview mirror as both officers suddenly approached him. The driver ran off and disappeared into the woods in the dark. The police chased him, but he was too fast and skilled. The police searched the area for hours, combed the woods, and checked the nearby houses. But he had disappeared, leaving even more questions unanswered. The next day, I received a call from the police telling me they had identified the driver, and he had a long criminal history. I am a taxi driver and have been doing this job for over 10 years. This happened almost 4 years ago, and I have seen all sorts of things, from drunk and loud people to quiet and reserved individuals, but nothing prepared me for the night I picked up a passenger who would change my life forever. It was a cold night, one of those nights when you'd rather stay home and snuggle under the covers. But duty called, and I had work to do. I drove my taxi through the city looking for my next passenger when I saw him standing on the corner. He was a tall man in a dark suit and had his hands in his pockets. He pulled one hand out and waved for me to stop the car. He opened the rear door and got in, locking it behind him. I could see he was a bit nervous, looking around in the car as if searching for something. I greeted him and he responded with a nod. "Where to?" I asked. He gave me the address. It was on the other side of the city. I shifted the car into gear and we drove off. I tried to start a conversation to break the ice. He was polite but distant, answering my questions with few words. As we drove, he suddenly changed his mind and asked me to drive to a different address. I followed his instructions and drove through a dark and deserted street. Then he asked me to stop in front of an old building. It looked abandoned, so I wasn't sure what he might be planning. I hesitated for a moment, but he assured me it was safe. As we parked the car, he got out and told me to wait for him. I watched as he approached a man on the street. They exchanged a few words. The other man looked intimidating, with a shaved head and many tattoos, a stark contrast to my passenger, who looked like a businessman. I was about to leave, but just in time, my passenger returned to the car. The intimidating man followed him, and both sat in the back seat. Then my passenger told me to drive, and I did. I felt uncomfortable in this situation but could not refuse. As we drove, the passenger and the intimidating man spoke quietly to each other. I could only catch a few words, but I began to suspect that I was involved in a crime. My heart started pounding. I knew I had to do something to protect myself. The smartest decision would probably have been to just go along with whatever they were planning and then call the police later, but I knew we were only a few blocks from a police station. It was a quick decision, but I decided to go for it. I turned off and stepped on the gas as we approached the station. Suddenly, the passenger pulled out a gun and aimed it at me. "Don't even think about it," he said. "Keep driving." At that point, it was already too late. We were right in front of the police station. I stopped the car and both men got out and fled. I was shocked and could hear my pounding heart. After I caught my breath, I entered the station and told the police what had just happened. I still didn't know what those guys were planning, but one of them had threatened me with a gun. I described the men as best I could, but then I learned that they had been captured on the station's surveillance camera. We were so close. The next day, the police called me and asked me to come to the station to be interviewed. They had caught both men and wanted me to identify them. I went to the station, and they showed me a lineup of suspects. I recognized the passenger immediately. I pointed him out to the police. They arrested him and charged him with attempted robbery and assault. The intimidating man was also arrested, and they found a gun on him that linked him to other crimes. I was relieved to know they were no longer on the streets and could not cause any further harm. Over time, the memory of that night faded, and I returned to my routine. I had a few other frightening experiences over the years, and maybe I will share them someday, but this one is definitely the worst. The most terrifying event occurred when I was 10 or 11 years old, and my family took a trip to Germany to visit my grandparents. They lived in a small village right on the Baltic Sea coast, where the climate was warm and the beaches were beautiful. I always looked forward to these trips because I lived in the north, where the weather wasn't nice all year round. We always traveled in March when my brother and I had a week off from school. We always started early in the morning, long before sunrise. My father would drive, but my mother would take over from time to time so that my father could rest. The drive was long, and we always made it in one go with my father driving all night. We took short breaks to stretch our legs and grab something to eat. One of our stops was at a local restaurant where we thought we could get a quick and easy meal. While we were in line, a man began yelling at my father, accusing him of cutting in line. My father tried to explain that he hadn't, but the man wouldn't listen. My mother tried to calm the situation, but the man was too angry. I remember being scared and wanting to hide, but my father remained calm and didn't react to the man's aggression. After we finished eating, we went back to the car and hit the road again. Soon, we realized that the man from the restaurant was following us. We ignored him for a while, hoping he would turn off in another direction, but he continued to follow us. I watched him from the rear window and felt really scared. My mother asked my father what we should do. He told her to ignore him and that he would eventually get bored. Suddenly, he rammed into our car from behind. The impact caused our car to spin. My brother started crying. My parents quickly realized we needed to call the police. My mother dialed 911 and calmly explained what was happening. Her voice was soothing, although I knew she was holding herself together for the sake of my brother and me. Within just a few minutes, we heard sirens and saw a police car approaching from behind. We pulled over to the side of the road, and the other car drove on. The police car chased the other car while we waited inside. Another police car came from behind, and the officer approached our car. He told us that they had arrested the man. I work as a truck driver. It was an afternoon in April, and my eyes scanned the road ahead of me. In my job, I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but something felt different that day. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was thick with humidity. It had been a day or two since I'd really talked to anyone, and my loneliness was becoming hard to bear. That's when I saw her. A young woman with long curly hair trying desperately to hitchhike. She wore blue jeans and a red hoodie and carried a small backpack with a single strap over her right shoulder. I slowed down and pulled over to the roadside. Then I rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" I asked. She nodded and climbed into the cab of my truck. Her eyes nervously looked back. She seemed nervous. At that moment, I thought she might be new to hitchhiking. I'm not an intimidating person at all, but I was a stranger, so that would be understandable. She seemed agitated and constantly looked out the window as if expecting someone to jump out at any moment. As we drove, I noticed a car behind us. It was a police car, but the lights were off, so I thought it was okay. Just as I heard a siren and saw the flashing lights, they pulled me over. I stopped immediately. At that moment, I thought I might get in trouble for picking up a hitchhiker, which is technically illegal where I live. My truck came to a stop, and I waited for the officer to approach. To my surprise, the officer demanded that the woman get out. As she got out, I saw her hands trembling and her face flushed. Confused, I watched as the officer handcuffed her and took her to the patrol car. Only when I heard it on the radio that there had been a robbery at a nearby rest stop did I realize what had happened. She had robbed a store and used my truck as a getaway vehicle. The officer put the woman in the back of the patrol car and then came to talk to me. He told me I should not pick up hitchhikers, but only gave me a warning without a fine. I was a bit shaken by the experience, but it wasn't too bad. The truly frightening event happened when I heard the story on the news. It turned out that the woman had shot a man during the robbery. She had the gun in her backpack when she was in my truck. Until then, it had been a good story for parties, but after that, it really scared me. That evening, the wind whispered dark secrets as I drove home after a long day at work. The streets were empty, and the darkness enveloped my car like an icy blanket. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, but I tried to stay calm, focused on safely getting home. Suddenly, I noticed bright lights behind me, an ominous presence in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another nocturnal driver, but it soon became clear that this vehicle was tracking every move I made, like a predator stalking its prey. The fear overcame me as the car got closer. Its high beams flooded my mirror, temporarily blinding me. I tried to stay calm, but my heart pounded against my chest like a drum signaling imminent danger. I sped up to shake off the pursuer in the shadows of the night, but he seemed to anticipate every turn and every alley. My breath caught and cold sweat covered my back. I felt trapped in an endless nightmare. I tried to call the police, but my hands trembled so much that I could barely dial the emergency number. The operator's voice sounded distant and distorted, as if he were speaking from another world. Time stretched out, every endless second, while the pursuer remained relentless. My thoughts clouded over with panic and despair as I tried to maintain control of my fate. Eventually, I ended up in a dead end, trapped like prey encircled by its predator. The pursuer's car stopped behind mine, its lights casting the night with a cold, cruel light. I knew there was no escape. With a lump in my throat, I shakily got out of my car, my legs barely able to carry me. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the air, approaching and then appearing in the darkness. The pursuer stepped forward, his face hidden under a dark hood, his eyes shining with an unfathomable malice filled with a sinister desire that chilled my blood. Terror overcame me as I realized that the pursuer was no stranger but someone I knew too well, an old acquaintance whose obsession had turned into a living nightmare. The last scream of horror was stuck in my throat as the pursuer lunged at me, his dark figure enveloped by the endless night. In that moment, I knew my struggle had only just begun, that the nightmare would never end as long as he followed me in the shadows.